Tatyana Baramzina, the Soviet heroine who died in silence. A young woman crawls through the mud under enemy fire. Through her telescopic sight, she calmly observes. She takes a deep breath, holds it, and pulls the trigger. Another German soldier falls. That's 36 now. But the sniper doesn't celebrate. She knows her fate is darker than most. This is the story of Tatyana Baramzina, a schoolteacher turned into one of the Red Army's deadliest snipers during World War II. A woman who went from teaching children to eliminating Nazis with deadly precision, only to face a brutal end that the Soviet regime tried to conceal for decades. Today we'll uncover the true story of a forgotten heroine, whose final moments were as extraordinary as they were tragic, and why the silence surrounding her death reveals much more than the Soviet authorities wanted to admit. Humble origins. Tatyana Nikolaevna Baramzina was born on December 19, 1919, in the city of Glazov, in the Udmurtia region of Russia. These were turbulent times, just 2 years after the Russian Revolution, with a country still recovering from World War I and plunged into a brutal civil war. Her family was modest, like most in rural Russia at that time. Her father, Nikolai, was a railroad worker, and her mother took care of the home and their 5 children. Tatyana was the second child, a quiet but observant girl who showed uncommon determination from an early age. What few people know is that Tatyana was an exceptionally dedicated student. In an era when many girls abandoned school early, she stood out for her intelligence and perseverance. Despite her family's economic difficulties, she completed 10 years of education, a significant achievement for a young woman of her social background. She always wanted to be a teacher, her younger sister would recall years later. She spent hours teaching us to read. When we were still little, she had infinite patience. In 1937, Tatyana entered the Udmurt Pedagogical Institute. By then, Stalin's Soviet Union was in full transformation. Political purges were at their height, and forced industrialization was radically changing the country's landscape. But for Tatyana, her world was reduced to her studies and her dream of educating the next generation of Soviets. From teacher to soldier, Tatyana graduated with honors in 1940 and began working as a teacher at a local primary school. Her colleagues describe her as methodical, patient, and exceptionally attentive to her students. What no one could foresee was how these same qualities would, in a short time, transform her into a lethal military sniper. On June 22, 1941, Tatyana's life changed forever. Nazi forces invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, initiating what the Russians would call the Great Patriotic War. The news reached Glazov. The enemy was advancing rapidly. Cities were falling one after another, and the Red Army was suffering devastating defeats. Tatyana, like millions of Soviets, felt the patriotic call. Although she could have stayed in the rear guard as a teacher, something perfectly justified for a woman at that time, she made an unusual decision. She volunteered to join the army. "I cannot stay teaching while our homeland is in danger," she told her family. "My students will need a free country in which to grow." Initially, she was rejected. The army was not accepting women in combat roles. But Tatyana didn't give up. She persisted, repeatedly visiting the recruitment office until they finally accepted her as a communications operator in 1943. The unexpected sniper. What few know is that before the war, Tatyana had participated in civilian training programs organized by WWII, a Soviet paramilitary organization that prepared citizens for national defense. There, she had learned basic shooting skills, showing a natural aptitude that went unnoticed until the war revealed her true potential. During her training as a communications operator, an instructor noticed her exceptional eyesight and steady hand during a shooting exercise. "That girl has an eagle eye," he commented, surprised by the precision with which a primary school teacher handled a rifle. This led to Tatyana being transferred to the Central Women's Sniper School near Moscow in 1943. The program was intensive. 3 months of rigorous training where they learned to shoot in different conditions, camouflage themselves, move silently, and calculate distances and factors like wind that could affect the trajectory of bullets. The instructors were impressed by Tatyana's unique combination of qualities: the patience of a teacher, the precision of a mathematician, and exceptional calm under pressure. While other recruits got nervous during shooting tests, Tatyana maintained an almost unsettling serenity. It's as if a rifle were an extension of her body, one of her instructors wrote in her evaluation. I've never seen someone so naturally gifted for this task. In June 1943, Tatyana graduated from sniper school with the highest marks in her class. What no one knew then was that this quiet teacher would become one of the most effective snipers on the Eastern Front, on the battlefront. In July 1943, Tatyana was assigned to the 252nd Rifle Regiment of the 70th Rifle Division in the 3rd Belarusian Front. While many famous Soviet female snipers like Lyudmila Pavlichenko had already made history in Stalingrad and other sectors, Tatyana arrived at the front when the initiative was beginning to shift in favor of the Red Army. Her first combat mission was near Vitebsk, in present-day Belarus. The commander of her unit, a veteran skeptical about women soldiers' capabilities, assigned her a quiet sector, expecting she wouldn't have to face much action. He was completely wrong. On her first day, Tatyana eliminated 3 German soldiers who were trying to repair a communication line. She did it with 3 precise shots from more than 300 meters away. Her commander, initially reluctant, was amazed by her efficiency. She doesn't celebrate her kills, her sniper partner observed. After each casualty, Tatyana simply notes the information in her notebook, position, distance, conditions, as if she were grading exams. During the following months, Tatyana became a ghostly presence that terrorized German troops in her sector. She operated mainly at dawn and dusk, when a diffuse light made it difficult to detect the flash of her rifle. According to military reports that survived, by April 1944, she had eliminated more than 36 enemy soldiers, including several officers and German snipers sent specifically to neutralize her. Her comrades again call her the Ghost of Vitebsk, for her ability to appear and disappear without being detected. What makes her record more remarkable is that, unlike other famous snipers who had assistants to help them locate targets and keep watch, Tatyana generally operated alone. The dual role, sniper and medic. A little-known aspect of Tatyana is that, in addition to her role as a sniper, she received training as a combat nurse. This duality of roles created a strange paradox. The same hand that pulled the trigger to take lives also bandaged wounds to save them. In the morning, she eliminated Germans through her sight. A soldier from her unit would recall years later. In the afternoon, you'd see her crawling under enemy fire to rescue our wounded. According to the records of the 252nd Regiment, by June 1944, Tatyana had personally evacuated more than 28 wounded soldiers from a battlefield. A particular skill she developed was providing sniper cover, while other medics evacuated the wounded. What few know is that Tatyana always carried 2 notebooks with her, one where she meticulously noted each confirmed kill as a sniper, and another where she wrote the names of each soldier she helped save, often with notes about their wounds and treatments. "It's my way of maintaining balance," she once confided to a fellow nurse. "For every life I must take, I try to save another." This duality of Tatyana, the combination of lethal precision with deep compassion, is perhaps what best defines her character. She wasn't a killing machine, as propaganda from both sides often portrayed snipers. She was a teacher who had found a terrible but necessary application for her exceptional precision and serenity. Operation Bagration. In June 1944, the Red Army launched Operation Bagration, one of the largest military offensives of World War II, designed to definitively expel German forces from Belarus. Tatyana's division was among the units assigned to this ambitious operation. On July 5th, near the city of Mogilev, Tatyana's unit found itself in the midst of fierce fighting. German troops, retreating but far from defeated, offered desperate resistance. During one of these confrontations, several communication lines between Soviet units were cut by artillery fire. The commander needed to re-establish contact with the neighboring battalion, and Tatyana, remembering her original training as a communications operator, volunteered for the mission. It was an extremely dangerous task that required crossing an open area under enemy fire. "I know the equipment better than anyone," she insisted when her commander hesitated. and I can cover myself if I encounter resistance." Finally, the commander agreed. Tatyana, equipped with her sniper rifle and communications equipment, departed at dawn on July 6th. What she didn't know was that she would never return to her unit. The last mission. The early morning of July 6, 1944, dawned misty near Mogilev. The fog provided some cover, but also made orientation difficult. Tatyana advanced cautiously, alternating between crawling and running in short stretches when terrain offered protection. She had covered approximately 2 kilometers when she detected a German patrol in her path. Using her sniper skills, she silently eliminated 2 soldiers before changing position. However, the sound of the shots alerted other German forces in the area. What happened next has been reconstructed from fragmentary testimonies of local civilians and a wounded Soviet soldier that Tatyana encountered during her mission. According to these testimonies, Tatyana managed to reach the forward post of the neighboring battalion, delivered the communications equipment, and helped establish contact with her original unit. The mission was accomplished, but the return would be even more dangerous. By then, the Germans had intensified their patrols in the area, aware of the presence of a Soviet sniper. Tatyana decided to take a different route for the return, longer but apparently safer. On the way, she found several wounded Soviet soldiers who had been left behind during a previous advance. Despite the risk to her own safety, she stopped to attend to them. She established a small improvised first aid post in the basement of an abandoned rural house. "I'll return with help," she promised them after stabilizing those she could. "Hold on a little longer." But as she was leaving the hideout, Tatyana and the wounded were discovered by a reconnaissance unit of the Waffen-SS. The silence and what happened in the following hours has been the subject of controversy and official silence for decades. Initial Soviet official reports simply indicated that Sergeant Tatyana Baramzina had fallen heroically in combat against fascist invaders on July 6, 1944. The truth, much more disturbing, only began to emerge in the 1960s, when a former Belarusian partisan who had been hiding near the place revealed what had really happened. According to his testimony and others that emerged later, Tatyana was captured alive by the SS unit. The German soldiers, upon finding her sniper logbook and discovering she was responsible for numerous casualties among their ranks, subjected her to brutal interrogation. Despite the torture, Tatyana refused to reveal information about Soviet positions and movements. Her military training had taught her that, as a sniper, she possessed especially valuable information about the front lines. What makes her story particularly tragic is what happened afterward. Enraged by her silence, the SS officers ordered a final act of cruelty. Tatyana Baramzina was executed with a point-blank shot, directly to the eyes, a macabre symbolic punishment for a sniper whose sight had been her deadliest weapon. The wounded soldiers she had been protecting were also executed. When Soviet troops recovered the area days later, they found the bodies and evidence of the inhumane treatment they had received. The uncomfortable silence. The most revealing aspect of Tatyana's story is not just her heroism, but the silence that Soviet authorities maintained about the exact circumstances of her death for many years. On August 16, 1944, Tatyana Nikolaevna Baramzina posthumously received the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest Soviet military decoration. However, in the official decree and subsequent propaganda materials, the details of her capture and execution were deliberately omitted. Why the silence? The answer reveals much about the complexities of historical memory in the Soviet Union. On one hand, the capture of Soviet soldiers was viewed with suspicion by Stalin's regime. The infamous Order No. 270 had established that there are no Soviet prisoners of war, only traitors. Although this extreme position softened during the war, the stigma persisted. On the other hand, the authorities feared the impact that revealing the horrific details of torture and executions might have on morale. Soviet propaganda preferred to present heroic deaths in combat, not the more brutal and dehumanizing aspects of war. And finally, there was the inconvenient truth that the Red Army had been unable to protect or rescue Tatyana and the wounded in her charge. In a system that presented the Soviet Army as the infallible protector of the people, such failures had no place in the official narrative. Thus, Tatyana became a carefully edited heroine. Her image appeared on Soviet posters, stamps, and school books, but always with a sanitized version of her end. Died in combat defending her homeland. The rediscovered legacy. For decades, Tatyana's true story remained in the shadows. It was only during the period of glasnost, openness, under Mikhail Gorbachev in the 1980s when historians and journalists began to unearth the untold stories of the Great Patriotic War. In 1990, a local newspaper in Udmurtia published for the first time an article detailing the real circumstances of Tatyana's death, based on newly declassified testimony from witnesses and survivors of the war. The revelation caused shock. For many Soviets, especially in her native Udmurtia, it was like discovering a completely new heroine. Tatyana's heroism did not diminish with the truth. On the contrary, it became deeper and more human. She was no longer a one-dimensional propaganda icon, but a real person who had faced horror with extraordinary courage. In 1995, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, a small museum dedicated to her was inaugurated in the school where she had briefly taught before the war. Among the artifacts exhibited was, for the first time, a copy of her personal notebook recovered after the war, with her own words revealing the complexity of a woman who never wanted to be a warrior. "Every day I pray for the moment when I can return to teaching," she wrote in an entry from May 1944. "When pencils will replace bullets, and the laughter of children will drown out the memory of screams on the battlefield." The woman behind the heroine. Who was Tatyana Baramzina really, beyond the heroic icon or the tragic victim? The testimonies of those who knew her before and during the war allow us to glimpse the person behind the myth. Her former students remember her as a patient but demanding teacher who had a special gift for explaining complex mathematical concepts in a simple way. She liked poetry, especially Pushkin, and often used verses to illustrate grammar lessons. Her comrades in arms highlighted her unusual calmness under pressure and her ability to maintain composure in the most extreme situations. "I never saw her panic," recalled a nurse who served with her. "Even under intense fire, her hands remained steady while attending to the wounded." A particularly revealing anecdote comes from a letter that a soldier from her unit sent to Tatyana's family in 1945. In it, he told how Tatyana had saved her sugar ration for weeks to make a small improvised cake for the birthday of a young soldier who had mentioned missing family celebrations. These small stories humanize Tatyana, showing us that behind the deadly sniper and the propaganda heroine was a person with interrupted dreams, small acts of kindness, and the constant hope for a return to normality that never came. Modern reflections on a forgotten heroine. Today, more than 80 years after her death, the figure of Tatyana Baramzina occupies a peculiar place in Russian historical memory. She is not as internationally known as other Soviet female snipers like Lyudmila Pavlichenko, nicknamed Lady Death, but her story contains elements that resonate deeply in contemporary understanding of the conflict. In modern Russia, where the memory of the Great Patriotic War remains a fundamental pillar of national identity, Tatyana represents a type of heroism that transcends the simple military narrative. She was not a professional soldier or a fervent ideologue, but an ordinary civilian who responded to extraordinary circumstances with equally extraordinary courage. Her duality as a giver of life, teacher, nurse, and as an instrument of death, sniper, encapsulates the terrible paradox that millions of ordinary Soviets faced during the war. The Nazi invasion left them no choice but to transform into something they had never aspired to be. For modern feminists, Tatyana represents a complex example. On one hand, she embodies women's capacity to perform traditionally male roles with equal or greater effectiveness. On the other, her story reminds us of the terrible price many Soviet women paid for this equality forced by the circumstances of war. Contemporary military historians have pointed out that the Red Army's extensive use of female snipers represented a significant tactical innovation that the Germans initially underestimated. Women like Tatyana took advantage of gender stereotypes. German soldiers didn't expect female figures to represent lethal threats at long distances. The echo of silence. Perhaps most relevant to our time is reflecting on the silence that surrounded Tatyana's true story for so long. In an era of social media, 24/7 news and information overload, It's easy to forget that much of history remains in the shadows, deliberately hidden or simply ignored. Tatyana's story reminds us that official narratives, whether from governments or other powers, often present simplified and convenient versions of the past. True respect for heroes like her requires the willingness to face the complete truth, however painful it may be. When we visit war monuments or read about heroic figures, we must ask ourselves, what stories are not being told? What details have been softened or eliminated? True commemoration does not consist of creating perfect idols, but of recognizing complete humanity and real circumstances of those who sacrifice themselves. Conclusion: the broken silence. In a small military cemetery near Vitebsk, in present-day Belarus, there is a modest headstone with the name of Tatyana Nikolaevna Baramzina. It does not mention the details of her death, only the dates that frame her brief life, 1919 to 1944. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, students from a school that now bears her name travel from Udmurtia to leave flowers and small pencils on her grave, a tribute to the teacher who became a warrior. The greatest homage we can pay to Tatyana is not just to remember her heroism, but to recognize the complexity of her story. A woman who killed to protect, who faced unimaginable horrors with dignity, and who, even in her final moments, refused to betray what she believed in. Her final silence, her refusal to speak under torture, was perhaps her most eloquent act. And our duty, as heirs to the freedom she fought for, is to ensure that true stories like hers are never silenced again. Tatyana Baramzina, the quiet teacher from Udmurtia, never sought glory, but her life and death remind us that the deepest heroism is often found in the most ordinary people, facing extraordinary circumstances with quiet but unbreakable determination. Her story, finally told in its entirety, challenges us to reflect on the true cost of freedom and the extraordinary courage that ordinary people can demonstrate in the darkest moments of history. Thank you for watching this tribute to Tatyana Baramzina, a symbol of courage and sacrifice. If you found her story meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to Century Time for more powerful moments from history. See you in the next episode.